Okay, so hi everybody. My name is Erica, and for years, Andy and I, this is Andy Millner if you haven't met him, and for years we had the idea that it would be really beautiful to share what it is that he does and thinks about and builds, and all the beauty that he adds to the world, to expose that to my community, our communities, and really give people an opportunity to see this art that isn't necessarily easily accessible here in San Francisco. So then Renee and I talked about a lot of different things, and I thought, oh, this is a great space for Andy's work, and this is a good opportunity for us to do something beautiful and bring something beautiful for which we could see and learn and enjoy. So that's the story. That's how Andy's here. That's how we're all here. And then we had the idea to do a talk in which Andy could share ideas with somebody close, who's Jill Tidman, who's the executive director of the Redford Center, who's going to talk a little bit about herself and what she does and why it has connection to all of this beautiful thing that we're trying to build for community all together. My pleasure.
Thank you, Erica. And thank you, Renee, and just for having the inspiring idea to make this happen. It's very exciting. Thank you all for coming. So yes, I'm Jill Tidman, for those of you who I don't know, which is actually most of you. So the Redford Center is a storytelling organization. We produce and support environmental films. So we really work a lot with art and nature, and have always felt that that combination is incredibly powerful. And so when we thought about an artist talk with Andy, I felt like I had some good context to prompt a conversation for us tonight. So that's why I was selected to do this. I also am very, very close with his wife, Jess, who we grew up together in St. Louis. So that's the other connection here. So anyway, thrilled to have an opportunity to ask Andy a couple questions about his work. And so since I always think about story, I'm going to start by just asking you if you can share a little bit about how story fits in when you think about work, and particularly when you think about a collection. I know that Andy created this collection for this space. So maybe specifically, the story behind this art that we're looking at tonight. Would love to hear you share a little about that.
Story behind the story.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jill.
Yeah.
Thanks, Renee, and thanks, Erica. Where's Erica now? Okay, thanks, Erica, so much for... Erica has always had these great ideas that bring people together, and I really appreciate you making this happen. And one thing, since 2020, I've really enjoyed more direct interaction, and this is like a perfect example of that. And so thanks everyone for coming. Being an artist, I didn't have much opportunity to hear from people and share directly with people, and this is it. I've decided, like, the thing I love the most is hearing what people see in the work, and this has already been so fun to be here. So thank you, and thanks, Joe.
Yeah.
So thank you for that question. So it's a complicated answer in that I started making these drawings on the computer 20 years ago, and I had a bit of a story in mind from the beginning that I was just going to collect drawings in a very simple outline, and I had a vague idea that I would put them together somehow, but I didn't know how. But I knew that drawing on the computer was different than on paper, in which they didn't exist in any scale or color, and that they could be reused, and that they weren't affixed to any surface and frozen in time, but they lived in perpetuity. And I was always attracted to natural things, and a lot of these plants are perennial garden plants, and so is it the same plant when it returns? Is it a different plant? And it lives on my hard drive, and when it returns, is it a different plant? But you'll see that, like a lily or echinacea, like these lilies here, they're actually the same drawing in those two things. A lot of the garden in these two drawings are the same, but I just reuse them, and every time you sort of create a new collage of these plants, it creates a new garden and a new space. So that's one aspect, this arc that has happened over these 20 years of collecting these plants into these landscapes. And starting to conjure a world. And this is the second show I've had called Floating World, and I'm not going to go on this long for every answer, I promise.
We want to hear it.
Okay. But so there is a Japanese term called ukiyo-e, which originally it meant sorrowful world, but then there was a very similar sounding word instead of sorrowful that meant floating. And this woodblock culture developed in Japan from like 1600 for like 400 years. And woodblock printing was a technological innovation, kind of like, these are all inkjet printed. And woodblock printing, like inkjet, democratized art and allowed middle-class people to own art. And that art from Japan, when Japan opened in the late 1800s, inspired a lot of the French Impressionists. And so Van Gogh and Gustav Klimt in Vienna all started to adopt Japanese motifs and ways of organizing pictures. So I love this idea of this floating world, of scenes from a floating world. And when I first was drawing these drawings, I was thinking that, wouldn't it be cool? And I do think of shows as a way of fleshing out an idea, and that I'm hoping that the different pieces give clues and insight into my idea. And if they vary a bit, like the portraits versus the landscapes, it gives more ways into the work. And rather than just having one piece, if I have 3 pieces, that's like a paragraph. If I have 15 pieces, it's more of a novel. And so I do think about the reaction of the pieces. And so the first show I had, I did think of this work as, art tends to be in squares, and squares, like photography and everything, is a human way of taking a section out of the world. And what if this world just appears on these squares around a gallery space, and conjuring this world on these little islands, and each island is a clue, a bit of an insight into what this world can be. And then in this show, I love the space. Thank you, Renee. And I did envision of just choosing one size work that would fit through the walkway, and that I could surround the viewer in this space and conjure this world. And in this work was the first time I really did think about story. And I started with this piece, and I had these in a certain series in my studio, and I thought of them as like frames from a comic strip or an animated movie. But as I was making them, I decided that it didn't allow the world to flesh out as much as it wanted to be. That oftentimes what I want is different than what the work wants. Or my first idea is not what the work really can be. And what I'm really excited about is that the world isn't a story. It isn't a narrative. It isn't a linear, it doesn't exist like we do in this time going from the past to the present. It can jump between all sorts of time. Like, that's actually what I think a large part of the art is creating an object that can contain lots of time of looking and drawing, but also that can exist on its own in a new manifestation. So I think of these as sort of batteries of time or places, and collapsing, decades, or this is another aside.
Well, no, it's a really great jumping off point to just hear a little bit more about your artistic process, because if you don't know Andy's other work that preceded this, my memory of Andy often when I think about your work is you in scaffolding, drawing a tree and drawing every sort of level of that tree. And so anyway, I think it'd be great for you to talk about how you create your work, and also how it's evolved to have the more human and animal figures in it, because the early work was very sort of floral in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so the first work I drew in 2005 was a tree in our backyard. And the idea was like, could you draw every leaf of a tree? And luckily I chose a pretty small tree. But the idea was, could I just take my hand and make a simple outline around every leaf? But a leaf of a tree, it's always varying, but it's always the same. And so my hand could make a simple outline and emulate a leaf shape, and I could do it 100 times, and it creates 100 unique shapes. And so there was this nice one-to-one correspondence between my hand and nature. And then to reduce a leaf to an outline, it immediately reduced this complexity of the natural world into a human language of line. And line is something that we don't think about as completely abstract and artificial and human-made, but line, like language, is kind of this magic trick that takes complex 3D space and it turns it into a symbol that we can understand. And so we can see this loop and see that as a leaf, but it without color or texture or anything like that. But so I was excited that I could draw all of these things and then on the computer put them all together into one document, and that it didn't exist, as I said, at any scale, and so those were printed as just sort of white lines against a dark background. And so in terms of trying to bring more emotion or so I did know that this was a lot of things I make to see them. Like they say like, a musician makes an album because it doesn't exist and they want to hear it, or a writer writes a book that doesn't exist, they want to read it. And I wanted to draw these things to see it. Like what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I did that? And so there wasn't any grand plan, but it was more of like step by step of wanting to see the next thing. And I always wanted to make them physical and analog and actually make them into things that can't be really understood on the screen, on the computer, that when you print something and you make it physical, you create this relationship with a viewer, that this is like, how does this compare to my size, and you have to get up close to it and far away to it to understand it, and you physically have to walk to understand it, and there's no other way to understand it. Zooming in and zooming out on the computer is not the same thing. A lot of people saw pictures of the space and you didn't know how big the space was until you enter it. And I often think about, we talk about 4K and how much information that is, but I mean, how much K is this, and this experience? And so I wanted to combine them together into these objects that become part of our physical world. And I don't know if that's because I grew up in a pre-digital time, but I think that as long as we are physical and living in the world, we're going to relate to physical objects in a different way.
Yeah. You're answering some of my questions as we go, which is
Okay.
great. I would love to hear more, and you talked about sort of just the organic nature of capturing the natural world, but I'm always curious what people's individual connections are, and if there was a moment where you felt inspired by nature, or if you feel like nature is a muse for you, and just could you talk a little bit about your relationship in that way?
So I'm a terrible gardener, but I think I've always been aware of. I remember I did actually have a moment when I was probably 20 or so in Lake Tahoe, seeing all of the pine trees, the conifers, and how vertical they are. And we just went to Muir Woods yesterday, and I remember being aware of how much information is in there. I mean, I try to emulate that, but it's nothing compared to that. That is the great repository of information in terms of like those trees, like they convey gravity, They convey every season, every year for 1,000 years, 2,000 years in their wood and their bark. And I think that I have always been aware of two worlds, the human-made world and the natural world. And that in our lifetime, more and more of our experience is made up of the human-made world. And there's kind of like a suffocation with that I always want to have a foot. I think in analogies, and I think of like a deep end of the pool or the ocean or the sky. Like you need to have one foot out in the human world and one foot out. And at Muir Woods, I mean, the air is very different than the air in the city. And to think that was the way all air used to be. And so I actually heard this article, and it was in the journal Nature, that there's a lot of talk about the Anthropocene and this human era and our effect. And I think that my work has always been at a more existential level. But in this article, it said that that the biomass on Earth, like if the weight of all living things on Earth, is now less than all of the human-made things on Earth. So in terms of if you took all the trees, plants, and animals and you weighed them versus how much concrete and all that, like it's tipped. And I feel like the virtual world has also been a tipping point in which more of our experience is virtual versus analog. So I think that, I purposely am trying to draw natural things, and by drawing natural things, that they're not the thing, that I am mediating the world by drawing it, and there is a certain loss, and there's a term in art called memento mori, which kind of means still life. And still life as a genre was created to remind Christians of this is temporary and this, you will die, basically. So memento mori is you will die, this will pass. And I think that there is that aspect in this work that these plants might not be here, and that it's transient, and we need to keep a connection to this thing outside of human-made things.
Yeah. It's we have a program that we run around nature connection, and that was inspired by some really scary data about how much time we spend indoors versus outdoors, and it's about 95% on average in this country indoors. And the idea that we're becoming an indoor species, and we need this type of connection, even if it feels artificial in some way. There's studies about just looking at a tree versus looking at another building and what that does to our physiology, because we are ultimately so connected. It's our life source, right? But as I think you used the word, the world is growing more complex, which I love because it is changing, and there's lots of feelings about how it's changing, but it's ultimately just becoming a much more complicated situation, and I'm very curious how that, or if that, has had any impact on your work.
I don't know exactly how to answer that, but I do know that, what's complicated for me is that, I have an arc in which I've had a 20-year exploration of things that I've been interested in, and I'm aware of having a different point of view at each different sort of age, and then within that, we've experienced the United States or our family, like how our role in our family shifts, becoming a parent. And so I think of these as like tectonic plates, or these arcs all these nested arcs. And so my journey in my family, our journey within the history of the United States during this time in the world, in technology, and so I think that, just to bring it back to art, that I think that what artists do is they attempt to just reflect back what they're experiencing, kind of like a canary in a coal mine type of thing. And that the more important artists are the ones that not only create meaning for themselves, but for other people. And then the most famous artists are the ones that I think capture a real change in culture. I think that, that's what culture is our means of communicating how we partake on things. Science also does that. And the combination of science and culture tend to tell the story of where we are. What does it mean to be human today versus what it meant in our parents' time or our grandparents' time, and what is the same and what is different. And I was talking with Erica. Erica's been spending some time in Hawaii, and we were talking about, is that the real world or is this the real world? Like, is it not the real world when you leave the present culture, like the media culture? And I think it's a good reminder, and I think nature, that's why nature is healing and restorative, because like those trees, like it's almost like you go to your parent for comfort. Like you want to go back to something that transcends or is more primary than the sea of information that we're living in. So I think that we're always going to have a foot in both worlds, and I can't sum it up.
Well, I think that's a beautiful summation, and I think it would be good to see if people have questions for Andy about the work. Happy to we have time to take a couple of questions. We also will have time. Yes, Jason.
So talk to me about the choice to use digital, as opposed to, I know you painted on canvas before.
Yeah.
Talk to me about why digital is important to you and why you decided to continue to use it here.
Well, I think I was aware that everything was being digitized, that like people, instead of writing on yellow pads, they were writing in Microsoft Word, and it was a way to contain a lot of information, but it also, every new media becomes part of the message, like Marshall McLuhan, and that how does digitalness change drawing? Photography was becoming digital, and I hadn't really seen much about digital drawing. And so I think it was just, also my background is a scenic artist, and where I paint for theater, and we always try to find ways of achieving something really quickly and really large and covering a lot of area. And so it was part of sort of my experience to turn to technology or tools, like, oh, actually if I do this, I could reuse it, I could change it. There was a lot of utility versus just pencil on paper. So, and then I like the underlying conception of it, as I spoke to, of it living forever in a way, that it had a kind of life that a drawing did have.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can you tell us how you think about color? I think
Yeah.
the colors are really special in these pieces.
Thank you.
Curious how you think about
So color has always been hasn't come naturally to me. Color, I always want color, and then it ends up draining out of things. Because initially, so I had a studio visit with this curator, and she said something that I still remember, which was like, you're a painter. I was painting. You're a painter, and it seems like, but you really love drawing, like it's really about drawing. And that was right before all of this, and I realized that line is actually what I'm really interested in, is line and drawing. And I saw a garden, and I was like, if I drew every contour of that garden, it would be like a Jackson Pollock. I mean, like a Jackson Pollock, and like a garden, you could weed whack the whole thing and put it into like one trash bag. You know, like it's a lot of information, but not a lot of mass. And I correlated that with line. And so a lot of the first work, I tried to make colored, but color really wasn't a part of it. It was really about the line. But it was only until I started to make these landscapes and I saw this Japanese woodblock work, and that this work is printed on mulberry paper, which a lot of Japanese woodblock work is printed on, and I've loved that, like the linen or the paper is actually a plant. And so this paper is made from the bark of a plant, and that's actually the natural thing. And so I took my cues for color from thinking about old, like I really wanted to create things that was ambiguous, if it's really old or if it's really new. And color has changed, you know, technologically, that there didn't used to be as many colors as there are in printing or in paint and things like that. And so these are a little brighter than the first work, but the first work was like vegetable dye and mineral pigments, like trying to emulate something that could have been around for a really long, for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so that really put the work into a more natural, subdued, close palette that worked with it. And then the paper itself actually kind of compresses the color, like subdues the color, and the compression in a file like makes it more narrow. But I did experiment with brighter colors, and then I toned it down, but I did, like, you know, but thank you for that. But also I think the process allows a kind of different experience with color, like pointillism or impressionism, in which, because these things are each colored and they're so small, that you get this overall effect. And you can use really bright colors, but because they're distributed so evenly and so in such a complicated way, it creates an interesting experience for color, like that I couldn't do, that I didn't used to be able to do painting.
I think Erica had a question.
I was just going to say that one of the very wonderful conversations we've been having, I think, has been about time and attention, which I think would be fun to hear a little bit about as it relates to this work and your process. And just my observation, what we talk about is like the lack of this sort of overall world's interest in time and attention. And that is very much required for like everything that we can do and be. And it's one of the things that I love so much about your work, so I'd love to have you talk about it.
So I don't think I have a particularly capacity for more like attention. Like people, it's weird how people have said, "Oh my God, you're so obsessive," or something like that. And I don't think of myself as obsessive.
Patient. Patient. You're very patient.
I don't experience that. I just experience it as I mean, I am able to pursue a project over a long period of time. And so I think that, you know, that's what they say about investing or anything. It's like, you gotta do the same thing over a longer exercise or anything, you gotta, and it's really true. And I think it's just, but I do really love, like, I'm starting to, I feel like that at my age now is a time to kind of make hay? Like to reap some of the things that I've been working on for a long time. And that I really do love that the process itself is able to hold so much time of looking and drawing, and that I couldn't just make that. Like I couldn't say, okay, this month I'm gonna just make that. That it took all that time to arrive at this now. And I like that. I think it's like creating, as I said, like this battery, this repository, this nature preserve type of a thing that allows all that time of looking and drawing to exist in it. And I love, like, looking at nature, you perceive that, like the viewer can perceive that. Like you can tell when something is quick or when something has time in it. And you know, the most beautiful things are the things that show time. Like this space shows time, the floor shows time. It's very hard you know, we renovate a house and then you don't want it to look brand new, like, you know, things get a patina and it makes it more meaningful. And so I'm glad that I love that was the first thing that Eric said, was like, these feel like a great representation of time and attention. And I hadn't really thought of that before, but, so thank you. Yeah.
I keep coming back to this idea of having one foot in each, nature and human. How do you hold the idea of humans as part of nature, and you know, how does that show up in your work?
That's a great question. And no, I think that humans are deluded in thinking they can be outside of nature. I think that humans are a part of nature. I just think that we get seduced by our own belly buttons. I think that we do definitely insulate ourselves and separate ourselves, but I don't think we are separate. In fact, I mean, this is a whole nother thing, but I think that nature has used us, and that I think the internet and all the communication, like, nature wants to propagate and communicate and network, and I think we are nature's servant. And I think even AI might be something that nature has done that created us to create AI for itself. And that I think we all live in such a small time frame that we're not really aware of where we are in that whole drift of that. But I think we are a part of nature.
Andy is gonna be around for a little while longer, and would love to have more conversation with anyone about the work. If you haven't been upstairs, you should definitely look upstairs. There's more work up there, and there'll be a public opening tomorrow night, openings on Saturday and Sunday, and a good chance Andy will be back in a couple months. But would love for you to, stick around as long as you want to. And Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jill. That was
what a beautiful conversation.